Hey everybody, this is Roshan Singhani. I'm a PGY3 resident going into ophthalmology, but not only do I really like ophthalmology, but I do really like tutoring, and so that's how I got involved with MST. And I'm hoping today we can help you guys plan the timing of your USMLEs. So really quickly, who are we at Med School Tutors? So we offer one-on-one online tutoring. And the thing I like the most is that it's really every phase in someone's career in medicine, from pre-med to residency to even board prep. The cool thing is that we have a lot of tutors who are in very different phases. So you have residents like me, you have med students, you have attendings. So everyone's kind of like their own bit of niche, and what they know really reflects how they're matched with students. So, for instance, I'm a resident who's a little bit further along in his residency career. So I felt like, step 3 and step 2, that's where I could offer the most insight to my students. And generally that's the subjects that I tutor. Whereas someone just finishing, their third year and fourth year who's still a medical student, they might be the best ones for step 1. And I think we do a very good job of matching the right students to the right, residents or med students or attendings and helping them find success. So today what we're going to cover, everyone knows that there are some changes coming to step 1. What is that going to do to residency applications? When do we take step 1? Are you trying to take it before it becomes pass-fail? Or are you trying to take it after pass-fail? When to take step 2? Do we think that step 2 will now matter more? And we're going to do a little bit of Q&A. The Q&A is something that I particularly always like with these webinars. Feel free to ask any and all questions. We'll do our best to address them at the end. If for some reason, I think that feel free to answer, and I'll try to answer during the presentation. But if I think it might be better served towards the end of the presentation, I'll just mention that, that I'll address it later. Or if you don't hear from me, feel free to ask again. So in terms of the new scoring system, so as of January 26, 2022, so very much coming up, and May 1st in 2022 for the COMLEX, we're going to a pass-fail system for step 1. And for the longest time, step 1 was considered a big barometer to determine one's competency as a resident, as a future resident, and also to give you an idea of where you stand compared to your fellow students. Now, it became so synonymous that the certain scores were synonymous with certain specialties, and I think part of that led to a lot of stress, a lot of fear about this one test determining one's career, and that kind of led to the push to become pass-fail. So now, in terms of how that affects you yourself as someone who's viewing this webinar, if you're planning on matching this year, then the pass-fail doesn't really have any effect. You're like any other student. You're like me. Your steps score is not pass-fail. It is based on a numerical value. Now, in 2022, we're going to have a mix of students. A lot of students that I know of are trying to get in and trying to finish step 1 before it becomes pass-fail so they can have their numeric score. And we'll talk a little bit about why that is after. Now, if you're matching in 2023, so you're a first or second year medical student, it's only going to be pass-fail. So, take that into account when you decide things like, for instance, if you want to go into a competitive specialty, I always felt that the one thing about step 1 that I did enjoy was that it did level the playing field for people who had, different medical schools, different backgrounds, different levels of research. So just keep that in mind, that you may not have that extra boost in case you feel like you're lacking in some other parts of your application. So, the big thing here is that, now step 1 is no longer going to have that sort of, that extreme barometer. It's going to be a pass-fail. So what I want to go into more, though, is that, sorry, give me one moment. And what I would like to go into more is what is going to be going on with step 2. So when it comes to step 2, the question is going to become, is this going to now become even more important than it used to be? Now, step 2 historically has been a high valued score, but generally people say, okay, your step 1 score needs to be close to your step 2 score, and then step 2, yes, it's important to do well, but your step 1 score now becomes the #1 barometer. From who I've talked to, in terms of program directors, other residents, no one really knows, but at least kind of talking to other people in the application cycle and, in the residency application cycle, I think there is going to be a bigger push towards the importance of valuing step 2. Because at the end of the day, these program directors, you have to put it in their perspective. They're so used to a numerical grade that can help quantify where a student is at. And while it's not always, considered the most fairest barometer of one's future as, a doctor or physician, it does help, them, come up with simple decisions. Are you above a certain range that they believe is necessary in order to succeed? Because they view the score as a barometer for, either your overall hard work, your clinical skills, your knowledge, etc. So in terms of taking step 1, now, when should you take it? And it really does depend. Do you have a certain time that you want to take the exam by? Is your med school saying, you must finish it prior to January? In which case, yeah, then you definitely will be taking it and be getting a numerical score. On the other hand, do you feel like, this is something that you have a lot of flexibility? Maybe you're in your 3rd year actively, or you're in kind of a gray area between your 2nd and 3rd year, and you still have to take step 1. You can maybe plan that and decide, like, are you someone who thinks that, the stress of the test, the pass fail, will help you mitigate some of that stress, and you just want, you don't necessarily want historically competitive specialty, and you just want to get, step 1 over with, then it may make sense for you to push it past January. On the other hand, historically associated, specialties, they may, still be looking for that, they may even prefer comparative students who have, if one student has a numerical step score, the other one is pass fail, otherwise an identical application, the inclination is that they would probably lean towards someone who gave them a very quantitative value of, what they're used to. And the other thing is really, and this is, I think, is the biggest thing, do know yourself. Like, for a lot of people, step 1 becomes extremely stressful, and there's a lot of people who can rise from that and say, I know this is going to have a lot of impact, but I just need to work hard for these next couple of months. I need to have a great dedicated period, and I know I can do well. Or are you someone who you feel like, your clinical skills are excellent, your ability as a doctor, your knowledge base is very good, but you just don't feel comfortable? If that's the case, then, it may just make sense for you to do pass fail, because that you'll let all your other aspects of your application, like, your letters of recommendation, your research, your extracurriculars, shine, and you don't want a bad score kind of marring your application when you had the option to just simply show a pass fail score. So, just to review in terms of like what we would do for step 1 resources, the reason I want to go over this is because nothing will change. For the big thing is that you want to have a good foundation, whether or not you're studying for step 1 for your, whether it's pass fail or whether, you're getting a score ideally above 200. Now, the big thing is, as I mentioned before, everything is pointing towards the fact that step 2 will still be considered, a test, that it has numerical value, and more importantly, program directors are likely going to put even more weight on step 2. How do you do well in step 2? The number one thing I tell students is that you have a good foundation for step 1. And now, just to briefly go over that, the classic, methodologies that you go through first aid, you go through UWorld, and then you use additional resources. A couple notes on that. When you're going through first aid, I want to strongly recommend that the first time you go through first aid is not during your dedicated period or when you're studying for step 1. The best time is that when you're in your dedicated period, that you've already at least read through first aid once, okay? For me, the easiest way to do that was that my school used to go organ system by organ system, so pulmonary block, cardio block, and I used to just read the corresponding chapter in first aid to the block that I was doing. So one, it was helping me study. It may not always be relevant exactly for my test, but at the end of the day, your step exam is the biggest barometer for, what your kind of knowledge base is. So you really want that to be the most important thing. So, I found that kind of reviewing first aid throughout really helped me during my dedicated period, because it wasn't the first time I came across a lot of this material. I'd already come across some of the mnemonics, which I think is the most helpful part of first aid, and I already had a good idea of what the content was like. The next most important thing, and for me, honestly, the most important thing about, doing well in step 1 is UWorld. And I feel very strongly that there is a very correct way to do UWorld. Now, the way that I would recommend is that, one, UWorld should be treated like a textbook. Okay, so that means that every single time you answer a question, whether you get the question right or wrong, at least on your first pass, you read through every answer choice. Okay, and the benefit of that is that the answer choice that's wrong for this question may be right for another question. And the way that you kind of develop a strong foundation is you start getting an idea, even as you're reading the questions. After you go through 50% of UWorld, I feel like a lot of my students mention this, is that they start to think, okay, C is not the answer to this question. C would be the answer if this question was phrased this way with these buzzwords. And you'll start to recognize there's a lot of buzzwords, there's a lot of nuances to how you can ask these questions, but there's only so many ways you can test a lot of these concepts. And UWorld just does an absolutely beautiful job of showing you every which variation. Is it exhaustive? Will it show you everything? No, not necessarily. But if there's one thing that I felt helped me prepare the most for step one, it's definitely UWorld. Then it's all about incorporating these supplemental materials, okay? And everybody has their own strengths and weaknesses. I personally think everyone should be doing pathoma. The majority of step one is pathology and pathophysiology, and I don't think that anything explains that better than pathoma. It just gives you a very good understanding of medicine. I personally was not an Anki person, Anki or Anki, clearly I'm not a veteran because I'm not even sure if I'm pronouncing it correctly, but I just found the flashcards didn't really work for me. I know there's a lot of people who swear by it, but I think the one thing that I can say is that, I think I am a good example of someone who, was able to do well in step one without having to use, like an Anki resource or a Boards and Beyond. But then that being said, there's a lot of people who've clearly probably done better than me, who've done equally as well as me, and they probably use these resources. So a lot of what I say, succeeding in step one is finding what works well for you. And personally, there are some musts though. And for me, that's UWorld, First Aid, and Pathoma. And then generally Sketchy is probably, Sketchy Micro, I would strongly recommend. Those are probably the core four, but a lot of people will add their own resources as well. The key is avoiding resource fatigue and having a structured plan and schedule, okay? The reason that I mentioned the schedule is I think this is also one of the most important things that you can do to achieve success. So this is just a sample of a schedule, okay? This is not necessarily a schedule that I kind of followed, but I kind of did it a little bit differently. And I think if it helps, I can tell you what my schedule is like. But the point that I think we're all trying to show here is that not everyone will have the same dedicated period. I remember talking to some of my colleagues at other schools when I was an intern, and they weren't even given an allotted dedicated period. They had to kind of be studying even as they were doing their classes. I, on the other hand, technically could have done a 8 to 10 week dedicated period. I chose 6 weeks to, try to maximize studying without avoiding burnout. But either way, you have to take into account how much time you have. You have to be realistic with what you can do in that amount of time, and then develop a very good schedule, okay? And the key to a good schedule is being regimented and it not being too unrealistic. So here, for instance, they're kind of going organ system by organ system. And I guess, the way that I would point it like this is that you review first aid, you do cardio, then you do cardio questions, and then you're done with cardio. Then you go to pulmonary, then you go to GI, and you work your way there, okay? I personally, I like this method in the sense that like you kind of just have a very stepwise approach. But what I found and was what worked for me well as a schedule was I took first aid, and I knew I had to read first aid, and I said, okay, I have this many days for dedicated. I'd like to get through first aid in 4 weeks. What is the total number of pages divided by, the number of days, 28 days? It was as simple as that for me. And I said, okay, even if I'm in the middle of cardio, I'll stop right there because it is hard to read first aid. But if you can just get through, you can be, if you're meticulous and scheduled and organized and get through a certain amount of pages each day, you will find that you're really starting to develop and absorb this information. I remember I used to allot like about, I think it was 20 pages. I used to allot like 2 to 3 hours just for those 20 pages. And the way that I think I was realistic because I was taking notes. I was really reading through things. And I had to make sure that I was getting the most out of that. And then I would do UWorld questions. In the beginning, you'll start slow with UWorld. You'll wonder how people are doing, these 2 to 3 blocks of 40 questions a day. Before my dedicated, I had done a little bit of UWorld. Towards like, the beginning of my dedicated, I could do maybe 80 questions a day. Towards the end, I was up to 120, 140. Was I reviewing as thoroughly as I was before? Not necessarily, but was I still reading through almost every single answer choice? I would say so, yeah. The other thing that I want to bring up with this timeline is that a schedule, I think, honestly, is half the battle. Making a realistic schedule, knowing what you're capable of, and that's something that at Med School Tutors, I think we do really, really well. I've made a lot of different schedules for my students, and I think that's where I've been able to help them the most. Is that sure, I can help with content review. Sure, I can help them stay organized, help them plan ahead. But I think what you can do is if you know your student well, and I always try to get to know my students, I figure out what time they have available, what their needs are. I can help them develop a schedule, and if they can stick to the schedule, almost always I can guarantee them that they're definitely going to experience a score boost. So now on to, I think, a matter that's on a lot of people's minds. When should I take step 2 CK? So it really, like the previous answer, it does depend, but I think, there is a couple minimums, a couple musts. So generally, I would say take step 2 CK after you have finished your rotations. At the very least, you should have finished surgery and medicine before you consider taking step 2 CK, because those are the majority of step 2 CK, and we'll kind of go over the breakdown in some of the later slides. Now, at the same time, you want to take it before you're planning on submitting your ERS application. If you have step 1 and you're happy with your score, you can always submit step 2 CK later, and that's not a problem. And most programs are going to say, okay, yeah, he or she clearly did well in step 1. We're expecting the same thing on step 2. We will still consider their application. Just please send us step 2 once it's available. On the other hand, if you felt that step 1 was not, really reflective of your performance, all the more reason that you want to be doing really well in step 2 CK, and you want to make sure that score is out before your application. And if so, I always tell my students it's about how you present yourself. If step 1 did not go great, but you've done well in your rotations, you've honored your rotations, you've done well on your shelf exams, and step 2 goes well, now you're painting step 1 as an anomaly, as rather than that being representative of who you are in terms of clinical knowledge and what you're capable of. Now, a couple other notes is everyone has individual timelines in terms of when they're available to take the test, when they'll feel comfortable, when from a practice exam standpoint, you feel that you're going to be ready. Once again, something that I think at Med School Tutors we can really help with. And finally, a lot of this, unfortunately, the fact of the matter is there's some specialties that demand higher scores rather than others. So I think it's very important to be knowledgeable of what the average expectation is in terms of scores for your specialty, and take into account yourself as an applicant and say, okay, do I need to have, just my step 2 done, step 2 CK score, like kind of just there, and, obviously not too much of a deviation from step 1. Do I need my step 2 CK to excel? And those are questions you really need to ask yourself. And that a lot of that information is online about like kind of the average step 1 score, average step 2 score of individual specialties. So just to review, when it comes to studying for step 2 CK, the main player here is UWorld. Now, UWorld, for step 1, I recommend often doing it twice, but AMBOSS has now, really taken, I think, honestly, for lack of a better term, the medical school world by storm with their step 1 content. I personally have used it. I've seen great things from AMBOSS, and I think their explanations are excellent. So I think a lot of people now they're adopting doing UWorld once at AMBOSS like a first pass. In step 2 CK, I think that's still doable, but I think they're not as strong when it comes to step 2 CK. I think UWorld just still has that kind of great foothold and understanding of what step 2 CK is looking for in terms of kind of the question types, the clinical scenarios. And so I personally recommend to my students, try to do UWorld twice. Once you're going to do it through the whole year as you're going through each individual rotation, each shelf. And then it's important to try to do it. Most people for step 2, they have less of a dedicated period. And physically, you may struggle to do as much of that dedicated period. And so you'll have, I personally had 2 weeks. So I tried to get finish my second pass of UWorld as I was on my last rotation, and then finish up my second pass of UWorld by the time, I had finished my 2 weeks of dedicated. Online Med I love as a resource. I think it's a little bit more relevant when it comes to shelf exams and studying. But if there was ever a kind of a topic or concept that I didn't fully understand, I just found that Online Med, just did a very good job of kind of getting to the key salient points. Now, there's some people who say, no matter what, I'm so used to reading out of textbooks, I can't, just do questions. And I think that's understandable. I kind of thought I was the same way until I realized, the U world, I do feel very comfortable with my knowledge base, especially with how I was scoring on my practice exams and my U world exams. But generally, the consensus in terms of books is the first aid USMLE for Step 2 CK. It's good. It's not as elite as kind of first aid, and it seems like, in my opinion, a little bit kind of overboard. Kaplan's Master of the Boards, I actually kind of liked. I didn't read it, too much, but when I was skimming it, I thought it's not very it doesn't go into fine details, but it is very comprehensive. We'll go over overarching topics, and I thought it was a good way for me to say, I'm reading through this, I don't feel as comfortable with this. I need to maybe look this up further, either if that's Online Med or if that's looking up those specific UWorld explanations. Now, in terms of the breakdown, I know I mentioned this before. Medicine is the most important subject, so that's why you really need to. It's an absolute must that you do. If you are like kind of studying in the U.S. and you're doing your rotations here in the U.S., I would strongly recommend that you do your medicine rotation. Not only, obviously, will you have gone through medicine and you'll have done the relevant UWorld questions, you'll cover that content, but also, a lot of these concepts that you're going to see in these clinical scenarios, you'll see in real life. We practice evidence-based medicine. We pride ourselves on being that in a U.S.-based healthcare system. So the methods and the way that we treat things are going to be the ways that it's going to show up on the test. So like the classic example I think of, like how do you anticoagulate someone? If someone needs a surgery and they're on warfarin and it's an emergent surgery, how do you do a reversal? I've seen that firsthand. How do you transition someone from to a heparin drip to then going home on a warfarin so they're properly anticoagulated? I've seen that firsthand. So a lot of these things that I've seen exact questions, I could reference clinical scenarios where I had this almost an identical situation, and you would be surprised. It really does kind of make sense, and it really the way the medicine is being practiced in our hospitals is the way that the questions will ask. In terms of kind of the rest of the subjects, it is kind of spread out. In particular, like, surgery is also very high yield. So medicine and surgery, I think, are two minimums that must be done before someone can consider Step 2 CK. And another note before we go into Step 3 is, when it comes to Step 2 CK, I did feel like it does feel like a little bit more, relevant for certain types of people, in the sense that, I thought Step 1, yes, it does ultimately, test your knowledge, but it doesn't necessarily reward the type of clinical knowledge that, that made you want to be a doctor in the first place, right? So I think, my second year of medical school, yeah, it's tough, but a lot of times, like, at least you're learning, relevant clinical knowledge. And I felt like, compared to first year where there's, a couple like, esoteric concepts like biochemistry, et cetera, that I knew I wasn't going to be using, it's kind of frustrating to go through the process of learning it once again. And so I felt that, second year, we learn a little bit more relevant medical information. But third year is when you really feel like, you're becoming a doctor, you're on the wards, you're learning things. And so just to know, for a lot of people who felt like they struggled with Step 1, they struggled studying for it, they didn't feel their score kind of reflected who they were, just give Step 2 a chance. Know that, if you feel like you're doing much better in your clinical rotations and you're doing well on your shelves and you wonder, like, if only my Step 1 score was higher, just remember, you have a good opportunity with Step 2. If you feel comfortable with the material, you feel passionate about what you're learning, I'm sure that'll reflect in your score. Now, when should I take Step 3? So Step 3 is, considered out of all the STEP exams, definitely the least important. From what I was talking to is, like I said, other program directors, my, fellow Med School Tutors colleagues, I think it's still early before Step 3, now becomes, more important, is now a big part of future, not necessarily residency applications, because you already be in residency, but for fellowship applications. As of right now, I think, internal medicine, maybe they very mildly consider Step 3, but for the most part, I would say 95% of specialties aren't even looking at your Step 3 score. And I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. So at that point, your goal is primarily to pass, but sure, you want to do as well as you possibly can, and why not? So in order to do that, you have to ask yourself a couple questions. One is that residency is a whole new ballgame. When you're a third year, when you're a fourth year, don't get me wrong, you're busy, but your job is to kind of be there, and then once you're dismissed, you're done. You're not bringing work at home. There aren't any loose ends to tie up. But I can definitely tell you, as an intern, when you're on the floors, sometimes you'll end up staying late. Sometimes you're going to be working pretty hard. You're going to be working 1 out of 2 weekend days, or you're working both weekend days. Time is just kind of limited. And now that you're kind of working yourself, you're getting there early. You're there, kind of till the in the morning. You're first one in, last one out. It's exhausting, and it's very hard to study when you're kind of on floors. And by floors, I mean kind of like if you're in internal medicine, if you're in the ICU, et cetera. Like once you're expected to be there early in the morning, you're not on elective. It is hard to make time to study. So you have to ask yourself, when will you have time to study? Because you want to make sure that you're comfortably passing step 3. Not because the score matters, but because you don't want to be stressing, the day before, a week before, a couple weeks before, worrying, am I going to pass? Do I need to push my step 3 back? So the best time to take it, in my opinion, is when you have an elective. Okay, almost every field, that you're going to have a lighter period. I can mainly speak for internal medicine because I did a preliminary year, even in ophthalmology. Now we have a new type of preliminary year, but generally, almost always, interns will have elective time. I would say you can take it anytime when you have at least 3 to 4 weeks to. Now you don't have to study a lot, but just enough that you can feel comfortable. A couple other things to consider is, one, is there a role to taking step 3 prior to residency? Okay, if you're someone who feels like, like you want residency, your time to just be devoted to being a better doctor, you're worried that studying for step 3 is just going to be another burden, and you feel like you have so much time, and you do, don't get me wrong, before residency starts, then, it is possible to take. As soon as you have your, you certified your graduation from medical school, you're more than welcome to take step 3. Now, I personally was very big on, I wanted a break in between, finishing med school and starting residency. I was okay. I knew that I would have elective time to study, so I felt comfortable. But I remember distinctly having a student who said, he really wanted to get step 3 out of the way, and he thought that by studying for step 3, it would just help him prepare for residency more, and he was very excited to, do well in residency. And I said, by all means, definitely go for it. He did very well, got it done with, and I can say, that might not have been a bad idea. The other thing is, in general, I would recommend taking step 3 closer to the beginning of your intern year rather than later. As you progress through your residency, especially if you're doing something like more specialized, like OBGYN or pediatrics, you may not have as much exposure to, general medicine, and you may forget a lot of things that you would say, 6 months ago, you knew extremely well. That's natural, that's normal, and that's perfectly fine. But the way to mitigate that is to just take step 3 earlier when things are a little bit more fresh. And then finally, like I said, you really don't want to be in a position, one, because it's, it is an expensive exam, and two, it's just one more thing to worry about, that you're worried about passing. So make sure you do take practice tests. You don't have to be as meticulous in terms of, taking MBMEs, et cetera, but you do want to make sure that you're fully prepared and, well above the, borderline rate for passing step 3. Because, I'll be honest, a lot of people don't take step 3 seriously, and I think that's okay. But I think there's very varying amounts. Some people can get lucky. The test will play their strengths. They'll have done minimal studying, and they'll recommend, you don't really need to prepare at all. Other people will try that, they won't pass, and then it's just another headache. So just, bear in mind that step 3, yes, while it's not as important for your future prospects as for progression, you don't want it to be something that's holding you back or, leaving you stressed. When it comes to step 3, similarly, UWorld and MBOS are both great. I personally really would strongly recommend the UWorld Biostats review. And that's available even for if you're, you feel that step 2, you feel like you're struggling with biostats, and they are having a recent increase in the importance of biostats. That's something that's available, something I really, really liked and found that it even helped me in my clinical career just by having a better understanding of biostats, the role of that, and it's very, very reasonably priced. And then the other thing is it's a balance, right? Because I mentioned taking it before, you'll be able to lean on your step 2 knowledge. You'll still kind of have that basic medical knowledge. But if you find that, like, maybe you're going to be getting a lot of clinical experience, and this is mainly for the surgery, the internal medicine folks, or the people who are doing their prelim years, definitely use that to your advantage. Similar to step 2, even step 3, a lot of it is clinical scenarios. And a lot of, there's the one part that I think a lot of people worry about is the clinical cases where you're putting in orders, you're putting in imaging, and a lot of people worry about that. But the more clinical experience you have, the more that it just seems like another day in the office doing those clinical scenarios. So remember, just finding a balance and knowing, what strengths you have, based on your residency program, your specialty, and then using that to determine when to take step 3. So just to summarize, these next 6 months, you're going to have a lot of options when it comes to step 1 in terms of when you want to take them. If you don't have the flexibility, that's one thing. If you do, then it's very important to think about, what is best for you individually as a test taker and as an applicant. So it's going to be dependent on a lot of factors. A lot of that, I think, should be based on like the type of specialty that you think you're going to choose. So if that is something that scares you because you're not sure about what specialty, I think that's fine. But always, I was given the advice is always prepare to do the more competitive specialty. And if not, so what? You did a little bit of extra work, you did a little extra research, but at least you're not, fumbling towards the end and worrying about, what more could I have done? Instead, for instance, I personally was deciding between ophthalmology and internal medicine. Historically, ophthalmology is a little bit more competitive. And I ultimately decided that, even though I may, not choose to do ophthalmology, doing a little bit of research, making sure that I try to do as well as I possibly can on step 1, that's going to set me up for success regardless of what I choose. And I never wanted to be in a position where I didn't have the option to choose a specialty that I happen to be interested in. So based on that, the other thing is that, and this is what I was going to cover a little bit earlier, is that, it's important to understand, how are they going to determine you as an applicant without step 1? So a lot of theories have been passed around. One big theory is that now it's going to be the quality of your medical school. If you're at kind of like a top 20, top 25 medical school, you're going to likely indicate that 1, you probably have gotten an excellent education, which makes sense. 2 is that, to get to that medical school in the first place, you had to have been hardworking and successful. And then you also have a couple more research opportunities as well at more competitive med schools. Now, taking that into account, if you feel like your school, is not necessarily in like kind of the top 20, top 25 range or whatever arbitrary range, but you feel like, as a student, you're right there with these other applicants, it does make sense to maybe you want to prove that. And for me, the way that I proved that was my step 1 score. I was in, the med school that I went to was by no means top 20, definitely not, maybe not even within the top 50. But I did feel like, I was able to distinguish myself enough. And one of the ways that I did that was with my step 1 score. So just remember to take that into account whenever you're deciding, okay, what do I want to wait for pass fail and, deal with a little bit of less stress? Am I okay dealing with a little bit more pressure, knowing that it may set me up for a specialty in the future? So all those things need to be taken into account. Now, when it comes to step 2, remember that now almost no matter what, it's going to have increased importance. So a lot of people, I think, are kind of under the impression that, they can coast by step 1. They'll go ahead and, wait for pass fail, try to do pass fail for step 1, and then focus fully on step 2 CK. And the advice I always give is that, the best way you can do well in step 2 CK is having that foundation from step 1. Understanding the pathophysiology, understanding the concept of, how to answer questions, how to recognize buzzwords. And the only way you'll be able to do that is with practice. And the best practice would be doing well in step 1. So yeah, even if you become pass fail, even if you're, in your first and second year and that your score is not going to be there, I think it's still important to have a very, significant, important, it's not significant regimen, but to have like a regimented schedule for how you're going to go through the step 1 content, have a plan for where you want to stand, and use those practice tests to get an idea. The MBMEs that, you'll still be able to get scores for them. You'll still be able to get an idea of where you would have been scoring, and use that to guide you and say, okay, you're at a specialty that historically wanted a 240 or above or 250 or above on your step 1. Are you getting that on your practice test? If so, then that means you're doing a good job preparing yourself and studying, and you're setting yourself up for success in the future. For instance, with an exam like Step 2 CK, where you can show your stuff. Now, the final note is about Step 3. Like I said, you need to pass at the end of the day. But it's not, as easy as I feel like a lot of people make it seem. So have a good, efficient study plan. You don't need to obviously study as much. You don't have to be as stressed, but you want to make sure that it's not something that's hanging over your head either. So just make sure you have a good plan and you schedule accordingly. And the one thing I want to note is that, once again, we mentors can help with this, but even your school guidance counselors and your advisors, I feel like that is a resource that's very often underutilized. Even I personally felt like I didn't really fully utilize my guidance service, but they were always willing to help, and they are, they have their ear, their ear to kind of all these like kind of nuances of what program directors may be looking for, especially if they're linked to a residency program themselves. So, lean on them and use their guidance to help you decide, when the timeline works best for you, how to arrange a schedule, etc. A couple, final notes about MST. I know I keep mentioning this custom study schedule. I think it really offers a lot of value. We take time to, first of all, I love that when you are, as a student are interviewing to, see if MST is a good fit for you, they'll ask you a lot of questions about what type of student you are, what type of learner you are, and they will use that based on baseline surveys that we tutors give to link you with the right tutor. And I've always felt like, the students that I've been paired with are ones that I can help them the most. Whereas, there are certain students, I like to think that I'm someone who I'm very good at providing kind of a regimented schedule. I don't really like, leaving things like a little bit more in terms of, try to do 3 hours and just do whatever you need to in these 3 hours. I like to have specific goal objectives because I like the reward aspect of goals. So I think my students that I'm generally paired with are ones who need that kind of motivator. They need someone who's holding them accountable. And I think I've always done a good job of doing that. And that's why I've continued to get those students. And the custom study schedule, the study schedule, I spend a lot of time on with my students. I talk to them beforehand, before I send out the schedule. I make sure that, the schedule is realistic for them. I take into account if they're in like a vacation period, a dedicated period, and we use that all in determining the study schedule. And once you have a study schedule, and this, I can't stress enough, it just gives you a little bit more relief because you know that, at the end of the day, if you're kind of doing everything on your schedule and you can rely on yourself or your tutor to help you develop a good schedule, you're probably setting yourself up for success. And without further ado, then I think we're going to go into some questions. So I do see a couple questions already. I'm going to do my best to answer as many as I can, and then if any more are popping up, I'm more than happy to answer. So let's see here. Okay, so I've got a very good question about someone who is a foreign medical graduate aiming for to match into internal medicine, and how is Step 1 going to affect applicants like that? I will say it's still kind of up in the air, but I think the one thing that historically has been the case with a lot of foreign medical graduates is that their Step 1 scores and Step 2 scores are very often very, very good. And I think in particular, that has allowed them to distinguish themselves because there is a lot of foreign medical grads, and unfortunately, a lot of foreign medical grads do go unmatched. And so the ones that do match, in my experience, the ones that I personally know, have always had something on their application that's, really distinguishes themselves. For a lot of people, that's an excellent Step 1 and Step 2 score. And so in terms of how it would affect you, I think that pass-fail, it's obviously not going to hurt, and it's not going to, completely ruin your chances. But I think it's going to be one less thing that you can use to distinguish yourself from a lot of these other foreign medical graduates. And like I said, Step 1 is not the only thing that is what programs are looking for. I distinctly remember a foreign medical graduate who had so much research and clearly, was very passionate about the field. And I think that really showed in their application. I remember meeting them in the interview trail, and they ended up matching. And I said, I thought to myself, I don't know what their Step 1 and Step 2 score is, but I know for a fact that they they blow my research out of the water, and they're clearly very well equipped for research in the future and very passionate about the field. And I think that that's shown help with their application. So if you feel like you may not have as much of a distinguishing aspect on your application, deciding when to take step one, and if it's you want to wait till pass fail or not, it may be kind of something that makes you lean towards not doing pass fail and trying to get as high a score as possible. Okay, and there doesn't look like we have too many other questions. I think a couple of questions specifically about Med School Tutors, and one of our wonderful staff at Med School Tutors will be providing a link, and this will be recorded as well to schedule. The big thing is that when it comes to MST, one thing that I absolutely say cannot hurt is just scheduling a phone call. And you schedule a phone call, it's a free consultation, and we'll see if there's a role for us to help you. I think we are very honest that, we're realistic. We're not promising that someone's, we can, in 1 week or 2 weeks, we can, bump your score up 10, 20, 30 points. But we can promise that we'll have a solid approach, and we can do our best to adjust to your schedule to help you maximize your score. I think we have one more question, and I'm going to do my best to answer that, and I'll have maybe a closing comment or two, and then I'll let you guys have a great night. So give me 1 second. Let me just read through this question. Okay, so I think this is an excellent question about what do you do to help your application stand out in a world where you may be either pass fail, or you may not have, you're kind of in a period where you may be a third year right now, or actually a second year, and you're not sure if you'll have time to do a fully dedicated period before January 2022. What does help an application stand out? So I think a couple things. One is, for instance, depending on the specialty you go into, if it's one of the core 6, generally you really want to be at least highly satisfactory or honoring that rotation. It shows that you were passionate, you were working hard during the rotation, and hopefully, your performance on that rotation reflects that. I think that letters of rec go a longer way than people think. Even if someone is not, I think a lot of times people worry about, there being a big name in their field. And sure, that's great. But I think more importantly, a lot of people just want to know that you formed a connection with an attending, and that attending can speak for your hard work and dedication. I personally applied to ophthalmology, but very often I was asked about a letter I had written from one of the internal medicine doctors that I work with. And like I said, I had initially been interested in internal medicine. I thought I worked very hard on the rotation, and I think my attending recognized that and wrote me a very nice letter. I never got to read it, but I was often kind of asked about, what did I do to, leave such a good impression on that attending. And I thought that, it really, meant a lot to me that he went out of his way to write me such a good letter. But I was surprised by how much they were asking about, a non-ophthalmology letter. So I think letters of recommendation really go a long way. And I will say the final thing that I really think matters with an application is for something like research. Even in fields where historically maybe research is not as necessary, if you're doing research in your field, and especially if you can find a project that you're interested in, which means if you're interested in it, you're going to be able to talk about it. Interviewers will definitely take note of that, and they're going to ask you about your research. And if you can talk about it, and you can talk about it with passion, it's clearly going to reflect the passion that you have for your field itself. Okay, so I think that's everything for tonight. A final kind of note for everyone is that, step 1, step 2, step 3, these are very, very, stressful times. I remember distinctly kind of the stress of knowing that I had dedicated period coming up, then the stress of being in dedicated period, then the stress of waiting for my score for step 1, and the same thing with step 2. But just remember, and I mentioned this before, is that these scores do not reflect kind of your capabilities as a physician. And I mentioned this to my students. I mentioned this in previous webinars. But I think it's very important to understand that if you are passionate about your field of choice, your specialty of choice, and medicine in general, that I promise will shine through one way or another, whether that be in your letters of recommendation, your research, etc. Yes, a good score can really bring your application over the top. However, a score does not, is not defining of you as a physician. So just remember that, let your passion speak for itself. Do your absolute best. And the other thing is that, a lot of people have this mentality, I'm not a good test taker. Historically, I've never been a good test taker. I think that's something that, you really want to dive in and say, why do you think you're not a good test taker? Is there something you can address? Is there something where we can help you here at MST, or, your fellow guidance counselors? So is that something someone can help you through? Because knowing that this test does have an effect on your application. So just remember that, nobody is a bad test taker until they've kind of proven it time and time again. And I have a feeling that if you have the right study schedule, you have the right regimen, and you know how to maximize your strengths and weaknesses, you too will probably be an excellent test taker. Okay. I hope you guys have a great night, and good luck with all the studying.